Hello, everybody at Ringa. I appreciate your time to look through this with me, and I look forward to your feedback and any questions that you might have. My name is Rick, by the way, and this is the model that I built for my master's thesis. So to begin with, I would like to run through an agenda that I'll be working through. Firstly, I'll work through the problem statement, followed by the scenarios that I investigated. Then I'll work through the model that I built and talk about the main assumptions, the most important outcomes, and the findings that came from that. So to begin with, the problem that we were investigating is we were basically interested in developing a better understanding of how much it would cost to transition the heavy-duty vehicle fleet in New Zealand to hydrogen fuel cell vehicles for various scenarios. And a quick look at those scenarios. We defined scenario 1 and scenario 5 on the extremes, with scenario 1 having zero hydrogen uptake. So we forced the model to make no hydrogen fuel cell purchases. And in scenario 5, we forced the model to, from initiation, 100% of new truck purchases are fuel cell vehicles. And by looking at that, we can essentially define the extremities. But those scenarios aren't that interesting to us. What we're more interested in is the in-between scenarios that come from the parameters as per the data that we found. So scenario 2 roughly looks at what Concept Consulting said, and in general, that's a fairly low hydrogen future. Scenario 3 is a middle-of-the-road estimate. In the scenario, we essentially took the average of the data that we found. So if the capex of a fuel cell truck in 2030, if the data said that was going to be between, let's say, let me look at the numbers while they're right here, between 300 and 500 thousand New Zealand dollars, then the scenario pins that down in the middle at 400,000. Scenario 4 uses the most pro-hydrogen estimates that we could find. So if the spectrum was set between 300,000 and 400,000, then this scenario would go with the lower number, so with 300,000. And I can send this data sheet on to anybody that's interested. I've got the sources in here as well. But most importantly is that you get an understanding of the 5 scenarios that we looked at in the model. Now, the model itself is a system dynamics modeling model that we built in Vensim. And I think to begin with, it's important to understand that the most important value that the model is consistently calculating is the market preference for fuel cell trucks. Now, essentially what this is at any given moment, there's a certain number of trucks, heavy-duty trucks, that need to be purchased. And based on various market factors, we calculate the percentage of new purchases that would be fuel cell trucks. And you can then imagine if 0% of new purchases are fuel cell trucks, then the diesel fleet would just stay 100% diesel. And if that moves closer and closer to 100%, then more and more of the new purchases are fuel cell trucks. With that in mind, I started by calculating the levelized cost of hydrogen. We did this with a cash flow depreciation model. And the main paper that I used here was a Turkish paper by Zenk. I'm sorry, I've just got the DOI over there, but it was by Zenk, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. So we calculate the levelized cost of hydrogen. We also look at the total cost of ownership of the 2 different trucks, and the total cost of ownership of a diesel truck remains roughly constant throughout the model. There's not much changing there with the exception of carbon taxes. On the other hand, the fuel cell truck, obviously there's a massive variety of parameters that play into this. I quite like a quote by INREL. They said that there's limited robust data on many of the total cost of ownership parameters. And we found that to be true. So the various scenarios play into various levelized cost of hydrogen, which influences the total cost of ownership. There's also massive variation in the data regarding the estimates for fuel cell truck costs and how those costs are going to depreciate over time. So this is sort of one of the main modules that the model looks at. I've briefly spoken about the market preference for fuel cell trucks. That's the sort of heart of the model. And to go into that a bit deeper, the two main factors that determine the market preference for fuel cell trucks is the market's response to the cost burden of fuel cell trucks and the availability of hydrogen. So even if fuel cell trucks were extremely cheap, half the price of diesel, if there's zero hydrogen available in terms of refilling stations, then the market is still not going to buy those trucks. On the other hand, if there's a higher availability of hydrogen, then the market would look at buying hydrogen trucks, even if the trucks are a little bit more expensive than diesel. And the reason we did that is because we sort of said that alternative decarbonization options like biodiesel would be a little bit more expensive than regular diesel. So the market's price elasticity is very sensitive to fuel cell trucks being more expensive than diesel. But as soon as the fuel cell trucks are cheaper than the diesel trucks, then the market very quickly turns to hydrogen on the assumption that if all else is equal, the market will turn to fuel cell trucks because of the emission benefits that fuel cell trucks have. The next module is essentially a population model. So we have the number of diesel trucks, and that's increased by diesel truck purchases and decreased by the decommissioning of diesel trucks. Diesel trucks age out. I think we set it to 16 years, if I'm not mistaken. 17.8 years. I got that from the New Zealand government website. So as the trucks get old, they get decommissioned, and the number of trucks on the road decreases. The number of trucks on the road have an annual emission factor. This is based on the average emissions per diesel truck per year. So you times that by the number of trucks on the road, and you get the emissions per year, and we keep track of the total emissions over the modeling period. The fuel cell truck module is similar to that. So we have the number of fuel cell trucks on the road, and that increases with fuel cell truck purchases, and it decreases as we decommission those trucks. But instead of having carbon emissions, the number of fuel cell trucks results in a certain demand for hydrogen by those fuel cell trucks. And just for interest's sake, we also track the total demand over the course of the model. From the number of fuel cell trucks, we also run a forecast of the predicted future number of fuel cell trucks. And from that, we can estimate the hydrogen production capacity that is required, which is important when we come to the next module. So we bring the hydrogen production capacity required to meet forecasted hydrogen demand into this module. And from that, we can determine the dollars invested in hydrogen production capacity per year. So essentially what we say here is that if the forecasted requirement is more than our current capacity, then we need to invest. And if the forecasted requirement is within a certain percentage of our current installed capacity, then we don't need to invest. But either way, we invest a certain number of dollars into the hydrogen production capacity each year. We track the total investments, and whatever investments are made result in a certain increase in hydrogen production capacity, which is of course determined by the cost of production capacity per kilowatt. So the investments lead to production capacity being commissioned, which increases the installed hydrogen production capacity that is active at any given time. As with the trucks, that ages out. I think the lifetime on the production capacity is set to 20 years in this module at the moment. And then lastly, the installed hydrogen production capacity results in a certain amount of hydrogen being generated each year, which is of interest to us as well. So we look at the hydrogen generated per year as well as the total hydrogen generated over the course of the model. The penultimate module, we're interested in the investments required to make available the electricity that the hydrogen production systems are going to be using, that those electrolyzers are going to require, essentially. And what we said is that based on the work of John Cully Consulting, which phenomenal paper, I really, really enjoyed this. I think he pegs it down at about $80 per megawatt. $78 per megawatt hour. And using that $78 per megawatt hour, we assume that all electricity for the electrolyzers is coming from marginal sources. So what we're measuring here is essentially the investments required per year to make that marginal electricity available, and then we track the total that amounts to over the course of the model. The last little module, this is just a dashboard that I use to track the outcomes of any given scenario. I'm sorry, it's quite ugly, but I can toggle the various scenarios and then I see the outcomes on this side. I also made a sensitivity analysis that required a distortion function to enable me to run a sensitivity analysis of graphical functions, which the software didn't include. So this module is not really important for what we're doing at the moment. The main assumptions of the module I would like to run through quickly. I assume no alternative decarbonization options are available. We're not looking at battery electrics or biodiesel or any of those alternatives. To a certain extent, they did inform the thinking a little bit, but we're not looking at those specifically. Like I said earlier, we assume that if all else is equal, preference is given to hydrogen fuel cell trucks based on the emissions benefit that we get there. We assume that current barriers to hydrogen will be addressed internationally. So the current lack of standardization and regulation and all of the effort that will need to be put in to sort of iron out this industry, we don't look at that, because we make the assumption that by and large this is going to be an international industry that develops, and New Zealand isn't going to be footing the bill for that entire standardization and regulation process, although we acknowledge that some of it will come to New Zealand. We also assume that there's infinite marginal electricity available. That's quite a big one. And I think that those are the main assumptions. We also realize that the electricity grid of New Zealand requires an upgrade, especially if this amount of demand gets introduced to the system. But that upgrade is almost certainly due regardless of whether we go the hydrogen route or not with heavy-duty vehicles. So we don't look at the investment required to upgrade the grid either. We assume that will happen anyway, and it's not on our tab. The results of the sensitivity analysis. So we don't need to talk about all of these graphs, but we ran a univariate sensitivity analysis on a number of parameters, and then we ran a multivariate sensitivity analysis as well. Of most interest to this study is the multivariate sensitivity analysis. And in that, we found that the modules were actually more stable than we expected. The model is generally, all of these sensitivities are within reason, and we understand where they come from. The sensitivities that showed the parameters that were the most sensitive are, as expected, the graphical functions that determine the market elasticity. So the market's response to the cost burden of fuel cell trucks and the market's response to the availability of hydrogen. And those were also within reason, and in system dynamics modeling, it's pretty well understood that when you define these input-output elasticities, they are quite sensitive. Now, the results of the model, I've listed them all here, but I'm going to speak mainly to the charts. Because the scenarios were defined so differently, for example, in scenario 4, we make the assumption that hydrogen, the infrastructure and electricity and the trucks, everything is particularly cheap. So of course that drives up, the model moves towards 100% market preference for fuel cell trucks much earlier, which results in a higher final number of fuel cell trucks on the road. They obviously require more hydrogen, so we're generating more hydrogen. And the total dollars invested in marginal electricity is essentially directly coupled to the total hydrogen generated. So that's why the total dollars invested in marginal electricity in scenario 4 is also significantly more. But we see that the total dollars invested in hydrogen production capacity is actually the least of the three scenarios, even though the generated hydrogen is the most. And this is essentially just because we made very optimistic assumptions about the cost of these things. So it takes a bit of delving into, but one of the most important findings was that the cost of making that electricity available is a very big component of the investment required in this model. Now, I know that there are many assumptions that play into this, but I do think it's worth noting that even in the scenario that roughly follows the concept consulting parameter estimates, the cost of the marginal electricity is still far from insignificant. It's still something that definitely needs to be brought into consideration here. I think that those are the main points that I wanted to talk through. I would love to hear back from you, and if you have any questions or if you would like to look at my data sheet or have a closer look at the model, I'm more than happy to send any of this back to you or to answer any questions that you might have. Thanks so much for your time. I appreciate it and hope to hear back from you. Goodbye.